Hello and welcome back to this third part of the lecture on grassroots capitalism. So now we're going to look at the area of regulation, the effects that might have on small business growth, and the pros and cons, or the effects of being in the informal sector as opposed to the formal sector. So we're going to start with a look at the World Bank's Doing Business reports, because that's probably the most comprehensive attempt to gather quantitative data on the business environment, the regulatory environment across a number of countries. So in the Doing Business report, the World Bank again tried to combine many different factors and dimensions into a single measure. So how they do it, I won't read through all of these things here. Some of them are reasonably obvious, like how long it takes to get a permit, the marginal tax rate and so on. Some things are a bit less obvious, possibly. Protecting minority investments is the idea that how viable is the system of multiple people having a stake in an enterprise. So if you want people to be able to invest in and trust they'll get a return when they're invested in an enterprise, when they're not just the main owner, how well are their interests protected? Is it possible for the person that's a majority stakeholder just to really disregard what the minority stakeholders might want to do and just control the business themselves and maybe take steps which are unfavourable towards the minority investor? So how secure is the stake, and how, if there is supposed to be a formal way of them having a voice, is that recognised? Is that implemented? So that's to do with the efficiency of being able to spread ownership in that sort of classical capitalist way. The other one that's interesting is labour market regulation, because a number of different things go into that, but the thing that makes that controversial is that usually things about protection of employment rights, minimum wage and so on, that's counted as a down. Yeah, so that decreases the score. Anyway, so you've got numbers given in all different countries for these, however many there are there, dimensions, and then the way they convert that into a single number is they imagine that those scores, if you had the maximum score on everything, then you'd be on what they call the absolute frontier. So what they do is they look at, no country is going to have perfect score on everything, so every country is going to be inside that maximum frontier. So they measure the distance from where you are in this 8-dimensional space, from where you are up to the frontier, and call that the distance from the frontier. And the idea is the bigger that distance is, then the worse your regulation is. And when they do that, they can then get to what they like to do, which is to do these correlations. So here's the average distance to the frontier score in the first 5 years of the 2010 to 15. And here's employment growth rate. So it seems that the distance to the frontier score, which of course they invert. So the closer you are to the frontier, the smaller the distance, the higher the score. So this is good, getting close to the frontier. Then your employment growth is higher. And again, when it's good, when you're getting close to that frontier, so 100% would mean you're on the frontier, then unemployment growth goes down. So being close to the optimum regulatory frontier, as conceived by the World Bank, tends to give you better employment growth rates and lower unemployment growth rates. That's good things. So what we can see from that is that, okay, the higher Doing Business Index score is supposed to give us higher employment gains, lower unemployment penalties. And then they argue that the argument in the text is that, okay, poor or excessive regulation, the problem with this is it's leading to distortion. This is the mechanism explaining that correlation, that when you're far from that frontier, then you're distorting the economy, the way that the free market allocates goods and so on efficiently, creating distortions. Therefore, you're going to get worse employment outcomes and worse growth outcomes. So regulation does that. High and complex taxation, because it's not just about the rate of marginal taxation, it's also the difficulty and the complexity of the tax system, against distortions. And they look at 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the sort of case studies, and they find that in those 4 countries, I think it's Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana and Kenya, they found that in those countries it was clear to see that regulations was associated with lower productivity. So those are the World Bank's claims and findings. As I say, the labour rights side is particularly controversial. So, for example, labour regulation is seen as having a negative effect, and when employment regulation is stronger, that has a negative effect. So we're in this classic situation, as you'll see in other situations like the special economic zones, that there's a balance between labour flexibility, which is supposed to be good for encouraging growth, but the alternative is that then threatens worker protections. The alternative model, of course, is a more kind of Scandinavian model where protecting workers' rights increases productivity and therefore has beneficial economic results. That's not the official bank view. In terms of regulation, the views that the bank is putting out support the view of De Soto that improving property rights, more straightforward regulation, helps revive what De Soto called dead capital. So all the resources that actually are in abundance in developing countries can be used more efficiently. However, that's some others do agree with that. The work by Hassan, I think, in the reading list suggests that too much regulation in the Indian. I mean, there's a couple of articles in the reading list on the Indian situation of interest in that. There's the one by Hassan on regulations which put certain thresholds on. If you go over a certain size, then licensing and taxation increases, and therefore what people are trying to do is they try and avoid having to pay too many buildings. So lots of workers are packed in under one roof to avoid expanding into a square footage or a number of buildings thing that will put you into a category where you're paying your costs are increasing, cost of regulation are increasing. Garcia Santana, the article says that interesting in that the Indian case is interesting because it's had this whole long history of being heavily regulated, and since the late 80s into the 90s and into the 2000s has been more and more deregulated. So it's been a real test case for the effects of deregulation. And one particularly idiosyncratic thing about the Indian case is that the reservation laws, I can't remember the acronym for those, but there are certain products which could only be produced by small or medium-sized firms. So the idea was that by stopping certain popular mass consumption products being produced by larger firms, that would prevent larger firms from out-competing the smaller ones that encouraged thousands of small firms and medium firms to flourish and encourage employment growth. However, Garcia his argument was that this is a form of distortion. It's preventing the efficient allocation of resources. It's much more efficient to have larger units. And if you were to remove those laws, they predicted there'd be a rise in total factor productivity. Then, of course, since the 90s and up to I think 2015, they were finally pretty much removed these laws. There's been a natural experiment. It does seem that employment in those product sectors and productivity in those product sectors has indeed risen. So there is some support in India for the idea that some of these artificial barriers were counterproductive in terms of employment and productivity. However, some people disagree with all that, or many people have questions about that. The Altenberg study, for example, that compares India with Philippines and with Egypt, also mentions India and Portugal. They find that there is some evidence that these bureaucratic hurdles have an effect, but it's like secondary. It's not the most important thing, not the most important drivers. They contrast this narrow legalist point of view, which is only looking at specific business regulation. They think the wider environmental business environment or the wider economic environment in the country and the social and political environment is actually more important than that. So they contrast what they call the legalist view with the structuralist view in terms of explaining economic growth and private sector growth. So quite critical of the World Bank's narrow focus on just de jure, in those with the formal rules, because it's the culture and the ways of doing business and the cultural norms, trust and so on that are just as important. As due to labour protection, again, they disagree that many of these things should be considered as negatives, such as labour protections and minimum wages and so on. And they also say that the simplistic scattergraphs that the World Bank likes to rely on are really not evidence of causation and not adequately identified in that way. And finally, this links back to the study by Hsieh that I mentioned at the beginning, who said that the idea of the missing middle is a bit of a statistical illusion, but there is actually a much longer tail of small businesses in less developed countries. But rather than being a situation where big firms are favoured and small firms are somehow kept back, prevented from growing, in actual fact there are regulatory barriers that are because of that impression, people put regulatory barriers on the larger firms, thinking that the larger firms were somehow outcompeting the smaller ones. And in fact, all the firms are being equally restrained by this, because and what that does is it penalises scale and makes it harder for smaller businesses to grow and take advantage of the economies of scale and become more productive. And therefore, by removing some of these things which are preventing the larger ones to grow, the larger firms would grow more, indeed increase employment and productivity, and the ones that are smaller would also be able to move into that area where they become more productive in terms of TFP. Okay, what about the informal sector? Well, the Doing Business report, the World Bank does work on the informal sector. The Doing Business report is just about the formal sector, about formal regulation. And again, this is why it's restricted to this kind of de Soto kind of regulation view, rather than looking at the wider environment which affects formal and informal sector alike, the more structuralist point of view. The good reading here, the case study, is the Altenberg one, which looks at Philippines, India, Egypt, and a couple of others, I think. In this one, for example, this is the one that mentions India and Portugal. They're saying that when India and Portugal, it seems that when they lowered barriers for firms to become formalised, that didn't cause new firms to materialise or existing firms to grow. It just meant that successful informal sector firms were just now successful formal sector firms. So it raised formal sector employment, but didn't really change anything real in terms of the real economy. And then in the Philippines, India and Egypt, they got, for those of you that might be interested in impact or causal identification, they had a really interesting study which they identified firms at the time of the study where, and the sampling strategy is quite interesting. It seems a combination of real random sampling from lists of businesses and walking around, knocking on doors and seeing who they could find. So I'm not sure it's very convincing in terms of sampling, but the strategy in terms of the comparison, the research design side of it, was they found firms which had been small and unsuccessful, or small and hadn't grown 5 years ago, but now were approaching or getting to the 50 level, which in this context is the medium level. And they then looked at the reasons for that. So they did observational data collection from those firms, but they also, among the same set, they compared as a control group the firms that were still not growing, still around that micro, less than 10 size. And they found that when they did that, comparing the successful ones with the medium upgraders, so the ones that had medium upgraders with the ones that hadn't, the control group, they found that it was correlated. Indeed, there was a correlation between the firms that had grown successfully and moving into the formal sector from the informal sector, because these had all started informal. I should have mentioned that. But again, the causality wasn't there. It didn't. They didn't think there was sufficient evidence of causality to show that it was because they'd become formal, that's why they'd upgraded. In many cases, it seemed that first the firms had upgraded to a certain point, and at that point they then became formal. There were a few of them that mentioned informality as an advantage in the observational study, saying that it enabled them to reduce regulation and licensing fees and so on. But many other factors seemed to be, both in terms of observing the timing of the change to formality and in terms of the observational data, there are many other factors were more important than this regulation factor. So they mentioned among the constraints that held them back, there was indeed the law, but it was also attracting them and maintaining the right workers, getting finance, marketing their goods, their own education and experience, the drivers to push them forward, things like personal ambition, attitudes to risk, human capital, education, family relationships are quite important. Learning to manage, putting in place human resources management for people that weren't family members. Contract enforcement in situations where court enforcement was quite difficult to manage, how they get around that. So these kind of environmental factors were important, and human capital, relationships, family, kinship structure and so on were much more important than the formal regulations. So these arguments seem to be coming down much more on the side of the broader, beyond SOTO structuralist argument. So Asperger's, I'm going to show you some more sophisticated models later, or ways of thinking about it, but this is a good way of getting started, is just this onion model. So in the centre you've got the entrepreneurial characteristics. Those are important, they don't determine things. And the enterprise characteristics then is, okay, what market are you in? What machinery do you have? What inputs do you use? What technology are you using? Those things are all important, but they don't determine business success. You need to look to the personal and professional networks, the people they're embedded in, and beyond that to the business environments, and beyond that to the social environments. So to conclude on informality, is the informal sector, is it a reservoir of pent-up potential which aggressive regulation and inappropriate taxation and so on is holding? But if that could be reformed, all that pent-up potential would then launch into the economy. Or is it a kind of dual economy situation where you have a formal economy, which is where the growth in employment and productivity is going to come from, and you have this informal sector, which is really just kind of survival, which at best is a reservoir of future workers. And Laporte, in a major review article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, said that really the weight of evidence seems to be on the latter, that informal sector products and firms usually low quality, low productivity, they can't compete with the formal sector, let alone lead the formal sector on the whole. There are exceptions. But on the other hand, they're not a drag, they're not in any way holding back the formal sector or a threat, and they do serve as a training ground, reservoir of future workers. But apart from that, really, it's just survival and sort of welfare for people that are involved in it, but not a source of dynamism. And as development starts, some of those do indeed formalise, but most fade away with economic development. Okay, so in terms of onion model, the next part, again, we broaden it out more to look at that wider environment and the ways you can sort of start to get a handle on the way that the wider environment might have an effect on business growth. But I'll leave that for the next video because we've come to 17 minutes. So for now, thanks for watching.